Hello, welcome everybody. I have the great pleasure to fill your last minutes of the conference with some hopefully useful content. Today I will tell you a little bit about the tool that we open sourced actually it is 2 years ago now already, which was initially built in-house closed source on a little bit different technology stack, and it's about launching. So it's called LcDsl. But before we dive into that, I want to do a short introduction so that you have a little bit of a background of what we as SSE Schaefer do actually. So my name is Markus. I'm working for SSE Schaefer since 2005, so it's quite some while now. Marketing will bash me for that. The numbers are not really current. We have more than 10,000 employees right now, not 9,000. And we're developing a software called WAMAS, short for Warehouse Management System. This deals with intralogistics processes and what happens in warehouses. For that, we chose to base that on Java and Eclipse technology. So basically everything that we do is Eclipse RCP. And for that, we need a lot of launch configurations. In our workspace, we have not only our applications which we actually run in production, but as well we have a bunch of tools which we need to run. So a lot of launch configurations are around. In our typical development workspace, we have around 750 Eclipse bundles, so that's quite a lot. So as you can imagine, if it's hard to maintain lists of plugins for launch configurations, then it's not easy to work with such a large number of bundles. What is LcDsl? Yeah, basically it's an Xtext based DSL which allows to define launch configurations. So what Xtext provides us there is an editor, the compiler generator infrastructure for all this, and syntax highlighting, content assist, everything you know from Xtext if you know Xtext. We have currently built-in support for Java launch configurations, PDE, so iApplication, product, and so on applications, wrap applications, so you can launch wrap-based web applications as well, and launch groups, which have been introduced as well by me in Eclipse Oxygen, I think, or was it Photon? No, Oxygen, I think. LcDsl features some sort of automatic dependency management. We will see that a little bit later, but usually with PDE and wrap launch configurations, you need this add required button in the launch configuration dialog, or you need to manually check or uncheck plugins that you need or don't want to have. LcDsl automates this. In the end, every LcDsl launch configuration is basically transpiled into a standard Eclipse launch configuration. So they are still there. You can use them as you're used to. There is no difference. So it integrates seamlessly into the current way of working with Eclipse. And everything that operates on launch configurations works as well with LcDsl-based launch configurations. Then there is a tiny contribution which is actually not directly related to LcDsl, but it was created at basically the same time. It's the launch configuration view, and it has that's basically a small view where you can see all the launch configurations, launch it from there, and it has some integration into LcDsl as well. I will demo that later. Then launch configurations as they are in Eclipse right now, they don't have a really consumer-friendly API. So if you want to create a launch configuration programmatically in your Eclipse extension or whatever, that's not that easy. LcDsl has a very powerful API to do so, employing a standard builder pattern, so you can basically just build your launch configurations nearly as easily as when writing them in the file. And it's a lot more flexible than traditional launch configurations, as it allows for inheritance. So you can group and inherit certain attributes and plugin sets or whatever. And in contrast to the standard launch configurations, it allows to consume features, products, and plugins all in a single launch configuration. Usually, if you have a PDE launch configuration, you have to decide what is my base. Am I feature-based? Am I plugin-based? And then you can build your launch configuration. LcDsl allows you to mix them. So whoever had a look at the standard launch configuration? So this is basically the most simple launch configuration you can come up with, in traditional launch configuration XML format. Who thinks this is readable? Okay. Well, I don't think it is. How do you manage traditional launch configurations? You have these dialogs, and there you can do changes. It's distributed among all these tabs, so you have multiple tabs where you can add arguments, plugins, you can tell Eclipse to store the launch configuration somewhere, and so on. Then this dialog, this little validation dialog, I think everybody who ever built a PDE launch configuration knows that very well. This happens all the time. For instance, if you add a new plugin in the workspace, add a dependency to that plugin to your application and want to run it, then boom, nothing works. Why is that? Yeah, because Eclipse does not automatically analyze the dependencies of the plugin containing your application and adds them automatically. There is actually this checkbox to add new workspace plugins to this launch configuration automatically. Why are we not using this? So as I said before, we have like 750 bundles in the workspace, and we have like, I think it's 100 launch configurations or something in that area. Whenever we add a plugin, I don't want to add this plugin to all the 100 launch configurations. I want to add it to maybe 1 or 2 or maybe even 5, but not to all of them. Also, the add required plugins button up until I think the next Eclipse release, it has a tiny little bug. Imagine you have an OSGI application which has an indirect dependency to Google Guava 15 and 21, for instance. If you press the add required button here, it will only choose one of those, even though both should be selected. And that is because the code behind the add required plugins button, up until recently, it's fixed now, used basically technology from the plugin manager infrastructure, which was Eclipse 2 and 3 a little bit. Also, as a direct consequence of the not so readable format, diffs won't get any better than that. So I'm pretty sure that with some time you can figure out that I added a plugin to the launch configuration, but it's not really obvious. So that's a major point for us as well. Eclipse launch configurations, the order of the entries in the XML. I'm not sure if this is still true, but we had that when we first had our first go at LcDsl, is that it's unstable. So it happens from time to time that you open the run dialog, change nothing, exit there, and the launch configuration changed on disk, which produces a lot of noise in the version control system, which is of course undesirable. And that's the infamous API for creating launch configurations. This is a real-world example. We still have some of them around in our IDE extensions. I don't think that this is the best we can do to build launch configurations. I'm just not convinced. And this is basically the same launch configuration with LcDsl. I think the format is a little bit more readable. And as you also might notice in here, there is this PDE app. It has a dependency to a plugin lib. Let's call it lib. That's what I added in the other launch configuration. It's not mentioned here. It's not required because I anyway state that I want to have PDE app. So obviously I must also be interested in all the dependencies that PDE app has. Otherwise I couldn't launch it. LcDsl does provide the mechanism to fully manual configure dependencies. So if you there is a keyword for the launch configuration. If you add that, it will not use the automatic dependency resolution, and you can provide a concrete list of plugins which should take part in the launch configuration, which can be handy if you need to deal with optional dependencies in a certain way. Good. Management of LcDsl launch configurations. I don't need a launch configuration dialog for that because it's text. So there is the editor. I can just write anything I want. Yeah. The only management extension that we have is this launch configurations view, where you can see that LcDsl launch configurations are annotated with a small icon and the actual file that the launch configuration is defined in. So you can right click on any launch configuration and press edit. There is a context menu I can show you in a second. And it will jump to that file instead of opening the default run configuration dialog. Also, when looking at the same example as before, if I would have the need to add something to a LcDsl launch configuration, so this is a little bit made up the example because I don't need to add this line. But if I would want to have this line in the launch configuration, the diff is obvious. I can see in a second what was the intention of the change. Reuse of certain things for launch configuration. So there is this launch configuration prototype stuff that appeared in the last Eclipse release. I must confess that I haven't had any time to look at that, so I have no idea how good or bad that is. But in LcDsl, this is basically built in. There is inheritance support, so I can inherit whatever attributes of a launch configuration that I want to have. Also, LcDsl supports basically all the features of the launch configuration types it supports. So there is, I'm not aware of anything that's not possible to express with LcDsl for Java and PDE launch configurations, which is possible with the standard launch configurations. And with inheritance, you can basically inherit any of these attributes. Last but not least, the API. It looks a little bit messy, but if you read that, I think it's a little bit better than the example with the standard launch configurations. Basically, you have a builder, and then can in this example, it creates a complete new launch configuration, and then sets inheritance to a launch configuration from the workspace. So it will try and find this base Java log4j launch configuration, and then inherit any attribute from that, and that's basically a two-liner. So if I would only want to set, for instance, memory limits, I would need 3 lines of code to do that. This is already a more complex example, adding arguments and stuff, all basically from scratch. Setting memory limits, minimum, maximum, projects, types, whatever. Questions so far? Good. Then let me switch over to an IDE and show a little bit about that. So this project contains a very, very hardcore Java application. And I've prepared the launch configurations for that. As you see, this is already the sophisticated thing that I showed before with inheritance. And now I can also show you the launch configuration view that for some reason misses the something broke. No. Okay. So that's a little bit of a pitfall with all this. The launch configurations are generated when the Xtext generator runs. The Xtext generator runs when the auto build of the project runs, or any build of the project. So it might be the case that launch configurations are already there, but not associated with Xtext because the generator didn't run and didn't generate the launch configurations. So now obviously something happened in the background, the generator ran, and now you can see that there is the annotation with the file name and the little overlay icon hinting that it's Xtext. Now if I press edit, I will be here. If in contrast I will use a standard launch configuration, the edit dialog will take me to the standard launch configuration edit dialog. Running launch configurations from here is obviously pretty simple. And also the inheritance stuff, so if you have a look at that, I would whatever. You've moved this argument to the base class, and we'll still have the same result. So these are obviously inherited. This project itself is something noteworthy. You don't have a means of expressing that no matter how this project is called, that I'm in, I want to run this class over there. Eclipse itself does not have this mechanism, or at least I'm not aware of it. LcDsl has that, so instead of writing self, I could as well here put the name of the project, and it will have exactly the same effect. But with the difference that I could, if I have self here, I could copy this project somewhere else, name it completely different, and have the launch configuration still valid and working. So maybe let's have a look at the even more sophisticated application. Basically, it does nothing else than printing out some value it gets from some library, and this basically says system get property, give me the property, and that's it. I have prepared, of course, as well a launch configuration for that. It looks pretty simple. It declares that it wants to have the plugin PDE app. The library, you might have noticed that, is in the lib plugin, so it's not in the PDE app plugin. I have here the plugin declaration, and LcDsl will resolve the dependencies for me. Sorry. I can also have a look at the launch configuration that is generated from the LcDsl launch configuration. So this is the result of the Xtext builder running on the .lc file, and you will see that both the plugins that are required to execute this application are selected. Now when I run this, the expected result is there. There is quite a bunch of things that LcDsl supports. So you can set workspace directories, for instance, change that directory. You can force it to clear the workspace or the log or the config and force that, or only if it, or ask whether it should delete. So basically everything that you can do with any other launch configuration as well. You can specify execution environments, environment variables. Environment variables are something that are of some special interest in that case. We always had the problem that we had launch configurations and no way to specify the environment. This was the predecessor of LcDsl. And it's really handy, for instance, if you want to run an RCP application on a different display so that you can run automated UI tests on that application. You need to set the display. So that's something that we required. Okay. And now I want to as well demo the API. This thing is built on, is this large enough to read? Okay. This is built on Eclipse T. This is another project that we contributed to the Eclipse Foundation. That's basically a framework to help run simple, small pieces of software in the IDE, in the context of the IDE. But it should be of no matter for that demo. So I can create a launch configuration builder. In this case, I will create a new launch configuration named my launch in the workspace I'm running in. I can optionally try to find a base launch configuration. I can look up any launch configuration that's in the workspace. I could set to please inherit any attribute from that base launch configuration, or if it's not there, I will issue a warning. And then I will look for a project org Eclipse launch, org example launch, set a main type, and add some argument and run this launch configuration. So that's the plan. Of course, this is an IDE extension now. So I'm extending the Eclipse IDE with some additional code which runs this launch configuration builder. So what I need to do now is run an Eclipse, not some other application. So I have a launch configuration for that as well. It adds some features, mainly JDT, PDE, T, as that's the framework I'm using to run that code, and the launching stuff. So in this workspace, I have prepared this project which looks exactly like I hard-coded that in the launch configuration. Of course, you don't need to hard-code everything, but that's the same for every software. You can use parameters, configuration, or whatever, or dynamically calculate anything. And I have prepared this base launch configuration that I showed before, but I don't want to have that right now. Let's have a look at what happens if I run exactly that task, which does the programmatic generation of the launch configuration. As you can see, the launch configuration was there before. Let's maybe start clean. Okay, so no launch configuration, executing that bit of code, and the Java launch configuration, this my launch that I'm creating, appears. It has this some argument as argument. Let's have a look at that in a second. And it issues the warning, cannot find my launch base, as expected. So this is the some argument that we had from the launch configuration here. Now let's have a look what happens if I add the base launch configuration and I run this. It's still some argument. Oh, that's not good. Ah, sorry, my fault. I need to programmatically create the launch configuration, of course. So now that I've added this argument in the base launch configuration, it will tell me it has two arguments now: the base argument and the argument added by the builder, because it inherits the argument from the base launch configuration and applies that to the final generated launch configuration as well. Okay, any questions so far? Yes? Migrating existing launch configurations to the new mechanism. There is no migration. This doesn't exist, but I can show you very briefly maybe. This is our main workspace where we develop our application. So as you can see, we have quite a lot of, let's unhide this. We have quite some Java launch configurations. We have a few Eclipse launch configurations. And basically, I have written all of them, or migrated all of them, in a single day. It's just so easy to write this launch configuration once you know which application you want to run and what is the entry point plugin, basically. It was really easy to write these launch configurations. And even the most complex ones that we have, like this one, for instance, which runs a desktop client application. It has a base launch configuration with a ton of arguments, and then a few concrete ones with even more arguments, but you're there pretty quickly because of the content assist and the way you're working in there. Once you get to know it a little bit, it's like and you're done. Also, one thing that I actually forgot to show is the group example. Launch groups. So this is a launch group. The support for that is in, as I said, since Oxygen, I think, in Eclipse. So you can define launch groups, and LcDsl supports this. So you can define a group which runs the main LcDsl application, which is this plain Java application. It waits for 2 seconds after doing so, and then starts the PDE LcDsl application debuggable, and waits for an output which matches this regular expression to appear, and then continues to and goes on by launching the main LcDsl other launch configuration. This adopt in here is important when creating groups with long-running applications in there. So adopt basically means if it's already running, if this launch configuration is already there, then don't start it, don't wait, don't do anything. Just assume that this line was executed already. So this launch configuration is there already. Then you can specify, but you are not required to, specify a mode in which this application should be started. The default is to inherit. So inherit means if I launch the group in mode debug, this will be started debuggable as well. If I launch it in mode run, then it will not be debuggable. But you can force the mode so that, for instance, whenever I start this group in debug mode, this will never be debuggable, because that might be a process that you're never interested in debugging, or only a special group of people is interested in debugging this thing. They can change it manually then. Yeah, and if I run this, I don't want to save anything. Then we'll start the first application. Oh, I don't want to save anything. We'll start the second application and start the third application. Good. Yeah, well, basically that's it from my side. So if you have any questions or any... Yes? Yes, that's possible. So you can, instead of, so there are two. You can use any product in here. No, the product definition is only used for dependency resolution. So it will be taken into account to fetch all the plugins, features, and transitive dependencies that you have, but it will not apply the VM arguments defined in the product. That's not done right now. But if you need that, we can certainly add it. Yes, please. What's there anyway is this. So you can always prefix optional to any plugin or feature, and it will just ignore it if it's not there. No validation error, no. I think there is a warning. I think it will create a warning marker and hint you that this thing is not there. So if you're searching for the reason why the hell is this dialog not showing up in my IDE or whatever, then you at least have a hint that it might be because the plugin is just not there. Something like that. Yes? Yeah. If there is a way to extend LcDsl. Well, we discussed this last year. Actually, the way it is right now, it's Xtext based. So there is one grammar file which defines the grammar for LcDsl. So that has the support for all the keywords for all the supported launch configuration types in there. So actually, no, not really, because you would need to modify the Xtext grammar, regenerate all the stuff, and release that. But the plan is to be open for contributions in that area, so that anyone can add any launch configuration type that he wants. I will happily accept that, provided the code quality is high enough. And the only important thing is that that dependencies to, for instance, CDT must be optional in there, so that I can still install LcDsl in an environment where it's just not there. It has support for the optional presence of certain launch configuration types. So if LcDsl supports, for instance, the group launch configurations, you can still install LcDsl in a pre-Oxygen Eclipse, and it will just, once you create a group launch configuration, it will also provide a warning and say, hey, this launch configuration type is not supported by the current Eclipse version that you're running. So that's basically not a technical challenge, but yes, it must be added to the LcDsl itself. There is no extensibility mechanism. More questions? Yes? We thought about that and we talked about that, especially last year here at the conference. The issue is that Xtext is basically a showstopper for platform. So we would have to rethink the whole mechanism that LcDsl uses. One of the ideas was to use a JSON file format, JSON-based file format, and then maybe something based on LSP to provide editor logic for that. But to be honest, I like the syntax as it is right now. I would not want to change that again into just strings, because it's then just strings without any real logic behind that. Okay, if there are no more questions, then have a great closing session, a good trip home. Thank you.